Welcome to this short presentation regarding empirical methods. Last time we were talking about correlation between two variables, institutions, property rights and GDP per capita, and we saw that in a small empirical model we can simply stipulate that ln GDP per capita is alpha, a constant, plus property rights, beta 1 times property rights, where beta 1 reflects the slope of this curve. Now if we are doing something like that, you may immediately say, well, actually that does not yet tell us necessarily that property rights have a causal effect on GDP per capita. Because if you are looking at the world, then probably you will be finding something like that. Mainly that education, measured, for example, in the number of years, average number of years of education in the country, is also positively correlated to GDP per capita. Okay? And most likely, education here is also positively correlated to property rights. So where property rights are higher, education will probably also be higher. So what problem do I then have? Well, it may be the case, this I don't know, that education is influencing GDP per capita, and that education is also influencing property rights, and actually that it's not property rights causing higher GDP per capita, but that all is running through education. So for example, it could be that education is affecting property rights, and education is affecting ln GDP per capita, but there is no link between property rights and GDP per capita, only because education is positively correlated with property rights and education is positively correlated with GDP per capita. Do I also find that institutions, property rights, are positively correlated to GDP per capita? So it may be the case that there is an endogeneity bias in these estimates coming from the fact that I do not account here in this estimation for education. How could I then take account of that? Well, it's quite easy. I simply add the variable that is potentially omitted, in this case, education. Okay, so I control for the fact that education may have positive influence on ln GDP, that property rights may have positive influence on ln GDP, and actually that what is captured here by B1 may then actually be captured by B2 if it is the case that education only influences property rights, but property rights themselves do not themselves have a positive influence on GDP per capita. If this was the case, then property rights controlled for edu, for education, and ln GDP per capita. If this was the case, if I control for education, there is no link between the two variables, then I would have something which resembles a flat curve. So then beta 1 would be close to 0. That could be a possibility. Then I would be suffering initially, if I don't add education, from so-called omitted variable bias. If property rights continues to be positive, put a plus here, and of the same size of the coefficient as before, so if it's still coefficient size, it looks like that, and beta 1 remains roughly the same size as before, 0.98, well then I know that independent of the level of education in the country, property rights are still positively correlated with GDP per capita. Thus, by adding different variables, I can take account of so-called omitted variable bias. I could, for example, also add plus beta 3 health, an indicator for health, because probably good health may have an influence on GDP per capita. Health may be more positive in countries with good property rights, thus I have a potential omitted variable. Thus probably I would have to account for health too, and a number of other variables which are potentially omitted. And I can do that through my empirical methods. I can hold constant, I can control for a bunch of different other variables which may have an effect on GDP, which may be correlated with property rights, in order to estimate an effect of property rights that is independent of all these other variables. That's what standard econometric techniques are usually doing.